Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar with the title of Did the Black Death Create a Golden Age for Women in Medieval London? We're delighted to be able to offer this session this afternoon with Professor Caroline Mary Barron. A few housekeeping points before we start. First of all, you may know me already. I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the CEO at ZN Group, and it's my pleasure to chair this afternoon's webinar. First thing to do is to thank our sponsors. They allow us to range far and wide across the fields of economic, finance, technology, and this afternoon history. And we're very much looking forward to that, but thank you to our sponsors. The format today is very simple. My job is to get out of the way as soon as possible, so we can hear from Caroline this afternoon. She will speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll have time for questions and answers. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way to ask a question is to find the question tab in the dashboard and type in your question. When we come to the Q&A session, I'll field those, read them out so that the audience can hear them, and we can start that discussion with Caroline. Just a few housekeeping points. The session is being recorded today, and so if you want to go back and listen again or you want to recommend it to a friend, the recording will be up on our website within the next couple of days, and please do pass it on to people who you think would be interested. Second housekeeping point is that we will pass on your contact details if you ask a question during the session, so if there's a need for follow-up discussion, Caroline has your contacts. But I know that Caroline also is very happy for people to email her, and you'll see on the slides she's popped her email address onto one of the slides, so you can make a note of that and follow up if you wish to. So really that's all I have by way of the housekeeping, but it really is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Caroline Mary Barron, OBE, Professor Emerita, Royal Holloway, University of London, who really has taken an in-depth look at London in the past. And I'm looking forward tremendously to hearing your presentation, Caroline. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was that kind introduction, and I'm very impressed that so many people want on a Monday afternoon to listen to something about medieval London. What I want to do is to challenge the assumption somehow that women in the past have never been able to do anything significant, that they've always been second-class citizens and suppressed. And I want to suggest to you, by looking at the wills of 3 London women, perhaps the picture is a little bit different from that. I'm going to look at the medieval period. That really means from the period of the Norman conquest, mid-11th century, through to the early 16th century, the Tudor period. So I want to challenge this view that women somehow had a bad time in the past. And I'm going to do this by looking at 3 wills. The will of a woman called Emma, who was known as the smerewyf. I'll go into that in a minute. Her will was drawn up on in 1260. That is in the reign of King Henry III. The second will is the will of a woman called Mathilda Penne, who was a skinner, that is a furrier, and her will was drawn up in 1393, the reign of Richard II. And the third will is the will of a woman called Johanna Hill, who was a bell founder, a maker of bells, the sort of bells that hang or hung in church towers. And she drew up her will in 1441 in the reign of Henry VI. So the first slide, please. I want to look at, here is a map of London in the early Tudor period. And you can see, I wanted to show it to you because I want to remind you just how small London was. The population of London in 1300 was about 50,000 people. And you can see, if you look at the map, how the fields are closing in, as it were, on the north and east of the city. And you can see a little bit of urban development to the west. If you know London, I know many of you do, you can see the Tower of London down in the southeast corner. You can see the mark of Charterhouse up in the north. You can see the streets of Holborn and Fleet Street stretching away to the west of the Thames, and London Bridge, the only bridge across the Thames in the medieval period, roughly where it is now, and the Guildhall. Now, I'm going to show you where these three women lived. Emma, who was the smerewyf, whose earliest will is drawn up in 1260, lived in the parish of St Sepulchre, which is just outside Newgate. You can see London Wall, and you can see Newgate just to the right of that arrow. And St Sepulchre parish was outside the city walls. The next will is that of Mathilda Penne in 1393, and she lived very near to Cheapside itself, the west end of Cheapside. You can perhaps spot St Paul's lying slightly to the southwest of the arrow. She lived at that west end in the parish of St Peter Wood Street, St Peter West Cheap. And the third will is the will of Johanna Hill, who lived in the mid-15th century, drew up her will in 1440, actually 1441, I'm sorry, that's not correct. And she lived outside Aldgate. And she had to live outside Aldgate because she ran a bell foundry, which was a small factory in effect, and it had to be really outside the city walls for safety. And she's in the parish of St Botolph, Aldgate. So while we have that slide on, I wanted just to say something about the custom of London, because where you lived in the medieval period affected the kind of rules or laws by which you were governed. If you lived in a particular manor, you had to live according to the rules of that particular manor. And if you lived in a town, each town had different sets of customs and rules that governed how people could conduct their affairs. In London, just to pick up on the rules that affected women, the custom of London, as it was called, allowed women to become apprentices, and it allowed women to take on women and in fact boys as apprentices. A married woman in London could trade independently of her husband. In that case, she was known as a femme sole, whereas if she traded, as it were, together with her husband, she was a femme couverte, a covered woman. When a woman became a widow, the custom of London was very favorable to widows. They allowed her to have, and her husband was obliged to leave to her, 1/2 of his movable goods, or a third if there were children, which she divided with the children. A man would leave 1/3 for his children, 1/3 for his widow, and 1/3, as it were, for his soul, which meant for charitable works of various kinds. That related to chattels. His tenement, or the landed property, the woman could continue to live in the house they lived in together until she died or until she remarried. And there was a reason for this, because the city was very anxious that women should continue, widows, to run their husbands' businesses, particularly in the period after the Black Death, when the population dropped by some 50%. So the population of London was probably at its lowest point in about 1400. The city was very anxious that women, widows, should continue to run their husband's business. A bit the same sort of crisis that has affected shops and businesses in the period of COVID that we've recently experienced. Now, married women rarely made wills because their property was assumed, if they were married, to be held jointly with their husbands, and so went to their husbands. So the wills that we have mostly are the wills of widows. And just another quick word about the records of London. We're looking at a map of London. Very little of what you can see there on the map survives today. There are a few bits of the Roman wall. There is Charterhouse, little bits of Charterhouse. The Tower of London is still there. Guildhall you can still see. St Paul's, of course, was rebuilt after the fire. So what we don't have much fabric surviving of medieval London, but medieval London has, or the city today, has remarkable records surviving. They were largely saved in the fire. We have wonderful deeds that go right back to the 12th century. We have unusual collections of wills, again from the 13th century, both in the city's own courts and in church courts. And we have the records of city government, the Court of Aldermen, the Court of Common Council, the Mayor's Court. And we also have the records from the 15th century of the livery companies, like the Skinners, like the Drapers, like the Mercers, and their livery halls, which many of which were burnt in the fire but have been rebuilt. And finally, we do have records from the city's parish churches. there were about 100 parish churches in medieval London. Many of them were destroyed in the fire, but they have records which go back to the medieval period. So London is poor in surviving medieval fabric, but remarkably rich in surviving medieval records. Next slide, please. Now, this is the first will that I want to show you, and to me, it's the most exciting. I know it probably looks like nothing very impressive. It is the will of Emma, the smerewyf. Now, unusually, Emma was a married woman, and I'll come on to that. It's the earliest surviving will of a London woman. It dates from the middle of the 13th century, and oddly enough, it doesn't survive in London. It survives in the records of Christ Church College, Oxford, which are now in the Bodleian Library. And I'll explain how that comes to be. It's not where you would expect to find the will of a London woman. It's an original will. We have very few original wills. As you will see, the next two wills I'm going to show you are copies into the registers of the church courts. This is the actual original will. It's got seals hanging at the bottom. Some of them have gone, but you can see the tags. So it was sealed by Emma herself and others. It was taken to the Husting Court in London, where it was proved by her executors. And we have no other documentation about Emma. I know nothing about Emma the smerewyf, except for this remarkable survival of her will. It has 18 clauses in all. It's written as a solid block of text. It's written in Latin. But I've divided, when I read it, I divided them out into the separate clauses, bequest to different people and for different purposes. There are 18 clauses in all, and I picked out one or two of these to show you and translated them. Can I have the next slide, please? These are the clauses I've picked out from her will. Firstly, I want to show you the first clause. I leave my soul to God, the Blessed Virgin Mary and all saints, and my body to be buried in the cemetery of the Church of St. Sepulchre outside Newgate. That is the common format. All wills begin, because the point of a will, apart from leaving your property and your goods and chattels, you have to leave your soul. So they always begin by saying, and that's very common format, God, the Blessed Virgin and all saints. Then you had to say where you were to be buried. And here she's chosen the cemetery of her parish church of St. Sepulchre outside Newgate. Then the next clause I've picked out for you is she says, I leave to the nuns of Clerkenwell 1 mark. A mark is 13 and 4pence, 2/3 of a pound. To the nuns of Halliwell, to the nuns of St. Helens Bishopsgate, church is still there. It was a house of nuns. It became a parish church at the Reformation. To the nuns of Cheshire and to the nuns of Kilburn. I mean, I've drawn this to your attention because it's interesting that she was so concerned to leave money to female religious houses. Then she says, and this is interesting, clause 13, I leave my house in the parish of St. Sepulchre to Nicholas de Bailsham, my husband, for his lifetime. After the death of Nicholas, the house is to be sold and the proceeds distributed in bread, shoes and clothing for the poor at the direction of my executors. Now that's interesting. Firstly, she is leaving the house to her husband, not what you would expect. He's obviously a sort of junior partner in this relationship. But interesting, after the death of Nicholas, the house is to be sold. The house was sold. It was passed to a clergyman, a clerk, and he gave it to Osney Abbey. Osney Abbey is near Oxford. When it was dissolved in the 16th century, the property of Osney Abbey and its records went to perform part of Christ Church College in Oxford. And that is how the, sorry, ignore my phone. That is how this particular will happens to end up in Oxford, because it went with the property, as it were, as a deed, as it were, to ultimately to Christ Church and now in the Bodleian Library. Very unusual trajectory. Then we come to clause 15. I leave to Alan Hostarius, my nephew, 5 marks of silver, and I leave all my utensils to the aforesaid Nicholas. So she's leaving the tools of her craft to her husband. What that craft is, I find it difficult to know. A smerewyf would be thought to be somebody who perhaps made butter, something to do with animal fats, but I can't believe, because you'll see she was very wealthy, I find it difficult to think somebody could have become as wealthy as Emma simply by dishing out pats of butter. I think it's possible that she made tallow candles, which of course were very important in a society pre-electricity and gas. Or I just wonder whether smear also means ointment, whether she perhaps was some kind of leech or doctor or had medical cures. I don't know. It's a puzzle to me how she was so wealthy, but she certainly was. Look at clause 17. She appoints as her executors Lady Alistair Hadstock. The Hadstocks were one of the aldermanic families of 13th century London, so she's she's got very significant friends that she has in high courts of London circles, and Alan Hostarius, her nephew. I've commented she's very wealthy. In total, her bequests, I've just given you some of them there, amounted to £44, which in today's money is something like £33,000. So she has this extraordinary amount of movable wealth, and I'm at a loss to know how she acquired it, but certainly she did, and it's a remarkable will. Okay, next slide, please. This is the will of my next one, Mathilda Penne, who was a widow of a skinner, as I say, a furrier. Her husband had died some years before. This is a copy of the will, which is because, as I said, most wills don't survive in the original, but what we have is copies in church records. This is the records of the court of the Archdeacon of London. And her will starts on the left-hand page at the top and goes on for the whole of that page and half of the next page on the right-hand side. Her will is more extensive than Emma the Smerewyf's. It's got 57 clauses in all. And I'm going to show you a couple of clauses from her will as well. Next slide, please. Here we have the will of Mathilda. I'm going to draw out just a few of the clauses for you. In clause 18, I leave 20 shillings to the Fraternity of Corpus Christi of the Skinners of London. Mathilda Penne was, as it were, a paid-up member of the Skinners' Craft in London, the Skinners' Company. The Skinners' Company was composed of two fraternities at this period, the Fraternity of the Assumption of the Virgin and the Fraternity of Corpus Christi. Corpus Christi was the sort of top fraternity and became the kind of governing fraternity of the craft. And Mathilda is listed in their fraternity book alongside the men of the fraternity. There are other women as well as Mathilda. So she's a member of the Corpus Christi fraternity of the Skinners. Then clause 27, she leaves to Peter Herlaw, her kinsman, actually he was her nephew, £20 and my gold signet. She has her own signet ring, and that's interesting. And to Lucy, his wife, so Peter Herlaw has a wife, Lucy, who's get £20 of Mathilda's goods and merchandise, and my second best gown with its fur. And to the same Peter and Lucy, her nephew and his wife, she leaves a long list of household furnishings, which I haven't included here, and she also says, and my chests containing other necessary utensils from my household and my shop. So these are the tools used by furriers for sewing up skins and furs to make clothing. And she has her own household and she has a shop. She is a businesswoman. 28, I leave to the same Peter all the unexpired terms of my apprentices. So she has apprentices working with her, learning her craft. And I know it's interesting that another Skinner who died in 1386, he was called Blaise de Bury, he left his apprentice because you were supposed when you died, if you had apprentices, you had to make provision for their continued training. And he leaves the provision for the continued training of his apprentice, Robert Brown, to, I quote, Mathilda Penne of Wood Street to teach the said Robert her craft. So she was accepted as a teacher of apprentices of the skill of furrier, of skinning. And clause 43, I leave to Petronilla Scrivener a small piece of silver and a small mazer decorated with a squirrel. And what's interesting about that is that Petronilla is a woman and she's a scrivener, that is, a professional writer of documents. Perhaps she wrote documents for Mathilda Penne. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to show you the final will, which is the will of Johanna Hill. As I say, sorry, it's 1441, not 1440. This is registered in the Commissary Court of London. And I'm going to show you 3 pages. It's a 3-page will. So you've got the first page here with her name. You can perhaps see it, Johanna Hill, at the top right-hand corner of the page. Next slide, please. That's the second page on the back of the one we've just seen. And next slide. This is at the top third of that page, the final section of her will. Now, Johanna Hill ran a bell-making workshop following the death of her husband. She ran a very large household, as we shall see, as well as a workshop and foundry. And one of the things we know about her is that we know she was running this workshop because there happened to survive in the the church warden's accounts of Faversham in Kent. They have a copy of a contract which was drawn up between Johanna Hill, widow, bell founder, and the church wardens of Faversham. And this is in 1441. And she is agreeing to make 5 bells for their church. And she agrees that if any of them are unsound or don't work, they can be returned to her workshop and she will replace them. So she was an active bell founder. And she has a household and a shop and a foundry. In all, about 20 people are mentioned in her will. And I'm going to show you a few of the clauses of that. Next slide, please. Right, so here, clause 32. There are in her will, there are 56 clauses. 32, to John Woodwall, my apprentice, 5 marks, to be paid from the goods in my founder's shop. So here she has an apprentice. She had several apprentices, and she has goods in her shop. I should say that founders, she was a bell founder, but she also made Latin goods, brass goods, pots, candlesticks, smaller metal items. So they're not simply making bells, but she certainly is making bells. Clause 38, to John Acres, my servant. Now that means you could be called a servant. Yes, you might be a household servant, but servant was the word used for a qualified apprentice who finished his apprenticeship, but was still working with his master. He would be called a servant at that stage. So he's a skilled person who's finished his apprenticeship. John Acres gets 6 marks on condition that he continues to work for Henry Jordan. Now, Henry Jordan had married Johanna Hill and her husband Richard Hill's only daughter, Johanna. Henry Jordan, well and faithfully in the art and occupation of bellmaker. So she's giving him a bribe to stay working with her son-in-law. And 48, I leave all my goods, both domestic and those relating to my art of bellmaker, to be faithfully appraised by 2 or more men, and Henry Jordan and his wife are to have the goods before all others in order to fulfill the will of Richard Hill, my late husband, and this my own will. That is, she's saying that she was the executor of her husband, who died before her, of course. So she's saying that the goods are to be used, first of all, to fulfill the terms of her husband's will and her will, and then they can be used for other purposes. And next slide, please. This is the final slide I wanted to show you, because it shows you on the left, you've got the bell mark of a man called Richard Hill, who was the husband of Johanna, and he marked his bells with his shield with a cross and a circle, an amulet, a ring, like that. And his bells survive in about 22 churches in southern England. And then on the right-hand side, you have a drawing of the mark that was used by Johanna Hill when she was running the workshop. She uses her husband's mark, but she superimposes on it a lozenge, which is the heraldic mark of difference for a woman, to say, in a sense, same workshop under new management, female management. And her bells, as I say, survive in about 7 churches, and I have actually been up at a church tower and seen one of the marks on one of her bells. And just to remember, I mean, bell making was a very highly skilled, it was one of the heavy industries of medieval England. Now, Johanna Hill left total movable goods, total bequests from her movable goods in her will, £158, which is about £102,000 in today's money. So finally, next slide, please. Here, I just want to return to the map of London to remember what London was like, where these three women lived from the mid-13th century to the mid-15th century. And I suppose you might say to me, well, were these three women that you've picked out exceptions? What I would suggest to you, I think, is that though I don't think they were exceptional, what is exceptional about them is that we happen to have the evidence, we have their wills, we know a bit more about them, we can find out more about them. So what is exceptional about them is not what they were able to do within the custom of London economically. What is exceptional is that it's possible to find out so much about them. Okay, thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline, for that rundown of these three women. We've got a few questions coming. Hugh Purser, first of all, says, do we know how common writing a will was in these times? You know, what proportion of the population might have left a will?
That's a good question. I think a very high proportion, because even if you had very little to leave, you still had to leave your soul. And so, but what does happen is that I think everybody, or many people would make a will, even if they didn't draft it themselves, somebody would draft it for them. But of course, not all wills got copied out or enrolled. That's the problem. So there are far more wills than the number that we have surviving. But most people were expected to make a will.
Thank you for that. Trevor Hilda asks a very direct question. What is a mazer? Sorry,
it's a cup. It's a bowl, a sort of cup. Sorry.
No,
wood, actually. Yes.
I think yes, some kind of wooden bowl or cup.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Graham Elliott says, we just wondered whether we know whether the nephews referred to in these wills were on the women's side of the family, either a child or a sibling rather than marriage, and just wondering whether Emma Smerewyf's arrangement might reflect her receipt of inherited family money, which might have had conditions about non-transmission to a husband's family. Yeah. Is that kind of thing? Can we make those kind of assumptions from what's going on?
Yeah, I'm certainly. I mean, that's a good point, that women could inherit land to themselves and goods, and when we do get married women's wills, it is often, that's a good point, about the property which will, so to speak, come to them by inheritance or goods. But over and above that, she does seem to be running a business. I mean, she talks about leaving the utensils to her husband. And I mean, she has a huge amount of money to dispose of, and she must have got that stuff. Of course, I do wonder whether she was a money lender. I don't know. There's no evidence for that. But I just find the amount of wealth that she had to dispose of very remarkable. But you're right. Your question is right. It could be that it had come to her in her own right rather than via her husband.
Thank you. Hugh Purser's also asked, do we know the ages of these three women when they died? Do we have any of that data?
No, we don't. But we don't know. All I know is that Johanna Hill had a daughter who was of marriageable age. In fact, her daughter Johanna was not married when her father, Richard Hill, died, but was married by the time his wife died 2 years later. She had married. So she is I would say middle-aged, but that's all I can say.
We were talking before the session started about maps, and Keith Robinson has asked exactly what map have you used on the slides and what's its date?
Oh, I'm glad he's asked that. Thank you, Keith, for asking that question, because I'm very pleased with these maps. They have been constructed by the Historic Towns Trust, who do maps, and they take an Ordnance Survey map of a town. They've done York, they've done Hull, they've just recently done Swansea, and they map back the medieval and older buildings and try to get a sort of historic sense of the evolution of the town. You can't take an Ordnance Survey map of London in the earliest maps of the 19th century, because too much of London has been destroyed by the dissolution of the monastic houses, by the Great Fire of London, by the redevelopment of the Victorians, by the bombing of the Second World War. So for London, you have to start with the deeds that I mentioned, which all relate to property and to archaeology, and try to reconstruct it from that, sort of from the ground up in a way. And which means that they aren't as secure, if you see what I mean, as a map based on an ordnance survey would be. But I think they're pretty good, and we change that when we get new archaeological results. We alter things if necessary. But I think it gives you a good idea of what medieval London. So if you're interested, you can get a map of London in about 1300. It's called medieval London. And the map that I've been showing is a map of Tudor London, London on the eve of the dissolution of the religious houses. So before they all were dissolved in the 1530s.
Thank you. And Keith, no doubt, will be scurrying away to look that up.
I hope you'll go rushing into all good bookshops, as we say, and ask.
Thank you for that. Douglas Andrews asked an interesting question, just whether we have evidence that the Black Death kind of served as a leveler of private wealth in London, as it seems to have done in other cities such as Florence. And is there any evidence that women kind of were major beneficiaries of that shift?
So the question is specifically about wealth, as it were, rather than. Yeah, I wonder about that. The Black Death certainly, rather like the First World War, creates opportunities for women because of the shortage of men. And so, as I tried to show, the custom of London had always allowed women to do these various things, but you find far more evidence of them actually doing these things in the period following the Black Death. And yeah, I think I'm just thinking that's an interesting question about wealth. I think what happens in London is that obviously if you don't have if many people die, there are fewer heirs. So the people who are left obviously are more prosperous. And one of the things that is striking is that whereas a man was obliged to provide for his widow, for his children, and for his soul, there were no rules governing how a woman disposed of her wealth, a widow. So in the case of a widow, she had a lot of disposable income. And just to give you an example, when the City of London in the late 15th century was wanting to put new kitchens onto the Guildhall in London, they drew up a list of the widows of London, whom their development director, as it were, would go and visit and persuade them to use some of their wealth, because widows, a lot of the wealth of London, the movable wealth, passed through the hands of widows.
Thank you for that. Keith Robinson has asked sort of how to get in contact with the map makers, but I perhaps can leave that to an email discussion after the event. We'll make sure that you're in contact. Richard Priest has asked whether we have an understanding of the position of wealth of women before the Black Death and how widespread. So was there a kind of high watermark, or is this something which is a gradual development?
Well, one of the problems is, of course, that we have. The later we go, the more evidence we have. So the earliest records relating to London come from the mid-13th century, the period of Emma the Smerewife's will, which I got so excited about. And I think, I do think that the Black Death and the shortage of population made a difference to the position of women. As I said, if there are fewer people altogether, then women have a higher profile. One thing I should say, and I didn't make it, is that although I think women benefited economically and played a role in the economic life of London, running workshops, you find them in the customs account, you find them doing business with Italian merchants and so on. What, of course, they don't do is to have any role in the governing either of their companies, very rarely in companies, but certainly not in the government of London. They were never common councilmen, they were never aldermen, of course, not mayors. So they don't have any, as it were, political say. It's entirely, as it were, an economic role that they enjoyed. And of course, when the population rose again in the 16th century, a number of factors militated against women in the workplace. They didn't have, as it were, the political clout. They weren't in the place where decisions were made. They weren't in the Court of Aldermen, Court of Common Council to do anything about that. So women do tend to have a less prominent role in the economy of the city, though they were obviously there working, until then, of course, you begin to get various pressures in the late 19th century for the emancipation of women and pressures for them to be able to enter professions and so on.
And of course, there still hasn't been very many women Lord Mayors, so
No, not many.
A way to go there.
But there have been quite a lot of women as masters of companies.
They have, and as aldermen, yeah.
Yes. How many are there in your company?
We have no women directors.
Right, okay. Just worth knowing.
But we have around about half of our staff are women, half are men. But
yeah,
there we are. Graham Elliott's getting interested in the details of the rules around wills and asking if a husband survived his wife, did this mean that she couldn't provide for her soul?
No, I mean, she didn't draw up a will, but it was presumed that the husband would provide for her soul. I mean, that's a good question, actually. But most husbands' wills, it's interesting, when they set up a priest to pray for them, which was called a chantry, they would always say they were to pray for himself, for his wife, and maybe if he'd had 2 or 3 wives, he would name all 3 of them. And usually, you know, husbands and wives were buried together. If you'd had several wives, you tend to be buried with the one by whom you'd had children. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, Mathilda Penne, who didn't at least have any surviving children, she chose not to be buried with her husband. She said she wanted to be buried in the church of St. Peter Wood Street, near the place where I sit. Mm-hmm. So very much my spot. I'm going to be buried there.
Well, if you're going to haunt somewhere, good idea to haunt somewhere familiar, I guess. That's,
yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Keith Robertson says he's found the Historic Towns Trust website. Thank you again.
Good. Well done, Keith. Thank you.
But he also adds whether a different way of valuing sort of property and today's value. You know, we can use monetary inflation, but you could use the price of property. And whether you have any thoughts about, it's a sort of technical question about how you look at valuation.
Yeah, just to say something about inflation, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the records of the Court of Aldermen, Court of Common Council and 15th century records, that they would set the prices for bread and ale, and also for poultry and for meat and for other things. And the prices in the 1420s were the prices in the 1480s were the same. That, you know, we're so used to inflation that it was really striking to me how there was no inflation in the 15th century. The inflation does begin to come in the 16th century. Anyway, the question was about property, though, yeah?
It was about different ways of updating the value of, you know, you could use property valuation as a different inflation measure, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'm trying to think. Yeah, you get deeds and of course people selling property. I'm sure there are people who've worked on that who might be able to answer that question. I'm not sure that I can. I can only say that the thing about having a piece of property in London was that it often was burdened with what were called quit rents. So you'd buy it, but you were responsible for paying a quit rent to perhaps a religious house or to somebody else. It was used as a way of providing pensions for people or for providing donations to religious houses. So almost all property in London carried a sort of burden of obligations, which you had to fulfill when you bought the property.
Thank you very much. I should just mention for completeness that, by the way, our company has had women directors who retired recently. So
okay, good.
Just get that point in. Hugh Purser's been looking up the etymology of smear and just pass it on to comment. Interesting. You know, there is the noun sense of fat, grease, or ointment, but it's also cognate with Middle Dutch smear and Dutch smear, German schmear with grease and fat, and Danish smør with butter. So you know, there was something around that, and it would be fascinating to know actually.
Well, I'm grateful for that. I mean, I think the problem is I don't see how you could make the kind of wealth that is evident in her will from selling butter or maybe tallow candles, which were very, but I feel she must have had some other sideline that isn't apparent in her will.
Yeah.
But it could have been property that she was renting out. The thing is that, but you notice that, I mean, as you probably know, strictly speaking, a testament relates to your movable goods and your will relates to your landed property, as it were, or your house, your tenements. And her will, though, I've called them all wills just for simplicity, relates to both, because she talks about cash bequests and bequests of goods and clothing, and also of her house. And so, in a sense, she's rolled the will and testament into one, as we tend to do nowadays, actually.
Keith asked another question, which is, you may not really know, but do we have any idea how much a city townhouse would have cost to purchase? And I don't know that.
I mean, there were houses and houses. I don't think you can say just that any particular house. I'm just trying to think what I can. I mean, I know that the rents. I mean, it's easier to do the rent, I think, than the purchase property. But St. Bartholomew's Hospital had rented out, developed its sanctuary, its precinct, with houses, some of which would be paying something like 3 shillings a year, and the best ones would be paying something like 2 or 3 pounds a year. And that was a very good, that was the top of the market sort of house.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm better on rents than actually the cost of actually buying them, I'm afraid.
It's still a helpful guide as to what the cost of living might have been at the time.
Yes, it's worth remembering when you think about these sums that I cited, that if you were the usual salary for a priest to pay for him for a year to say prayers for you, so it was a living wage for a year, would be about £7 a year. And here are people leaving 40, 50, £100. I mean, that gives you an idea of what wealth these women enjoyed.
We're almost coming to the end of our time, I'm afraid. But just a question that you mentioned that obviously at the time women were members of the guilds, livery companies. Did that fall off again before it picked up again in later times?
Yeah, I think it did to some extent. I think they're much more evident in companies in the 15th century than they were in the later 16th century. And certainly the business of girls being apprentices certainly ceased to be so noticeable in the 16th century. And in fact, the Drapers' Company, when some man in the mid-16th century, 1550s, wanted to take on a girl apprentice, the Drapers' Company said, "Oh, I'm not sure about this. We've never had this," and had to look back in their records in order to see that it was, in fact, okay, as it were, to take on a girl apprentice. So, I mean, of course, women continued to work, but they didn't work in that formal way. An apprenticeship for 7 years, you were trained, your master had to look after you, had to make sure that you learnt the skills and so on. That kind of formality for girls seems to have disappeared in the 16th century.
Thank you so much. So we have come to the end of time. Hugh Peirce has dropped the email for the Historic Towns Trust into the question. We'll try and get that out in the email that goes out to people afterwards. Okay. So those people who want to look up the maps, we'll get that information to you. It's been a real pleasure, Caroline. Thank you very much for a fascinating insight into a slice of life that many of us won't know anything about up till now. And we do wish you well in your continuing research into fascinating women from history. And we'll look forward to maybe you coming and telling us some more about some others on a future occasion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you all for listening and for your questions, which are, interesting to me and make me think about things that I need to develop. Thank you all so much.
Just a brief word, first of all, again, to thank our sponsors who do allow us to run these sessions, and we are very grateful for that. We have a few forthcoming events to mention. Tomorrow, the ESOP Centre is running an ESOP SOFA, which is the Employee Share Ownership Programme SOFA. So if you're interested in that, do take a look. Wednesday next week, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'm not going to tell you any more about that. You can look it up on the website and find out more about what we're talking about, but I think it might involve space. On the 21st of August, we have a note on Perseus, helping unlocking finance for SMEs in the race to net zero. So plenty to follow up on. We do look forward to seeing you at our future events. Just finally, Caroline, once again, thank you very much for your fascinating talk this afternoon.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for hosting it. Thank you. And thank you everyone for questions.
We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.